How do you build a high-performing culture? This is Culture Architects. Candid conversations with extraordinary leaders sharing their biggest successes, failures, and lessons learned on their culture journeys. Here's David J. Friedman.
Here at the Culture Architects Show, we're always wanting to explore culture building from a variety of different viewpoints. And certainly one of the most misunderstood and maybe even, I might say, controversial aspects of culture building is DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, for a while, it seems like that was all the rage, and companies were increasing their commitment to DEI, and many of them were even hiring corporate officers to oversee their diversity programs. And here we are in 2025, and a lot of these programs are being attacked and even shut down. So this seems like a great time to get a much better understanding of what DEI really is and isn't, and what role it can and should play in building a great organization. Well, today's guest has a deep understanding of these issues, and he does a wonderful job, I think, of bringing, I would say, nuance and insight and clarity to this topic. Leotis, he goes by Leo. Leo Sanders is the Senior Director of Human Resources, Inclusion, and Belonging at the League of Women Voters of the U.S. The League of Women Voters, a lot of people might know about them. They're a nonpartisan grassroots organization founded way back in 1920 with the aim of guiding 20 million newly enfranchised women to vote, as the 19th Amendment was ratified and passed into law that same year. The organization marked its 100th year last year in 2020. Leo himself has over 20 years of experience at the intersection of HR, equity, and organizational development. From 2009 to 2023, he was the Chief Civil Rights Officer and the Chief Diversity Officer for New Jersey Transit. We're going to learn a little bit about that today. But before that, he was also Director of Diversity with Macy's, so he's got a really strong background in this. We're thrilled to have him with us today. Leo, welcome to the Culture Architects Podcast.
Thank you so much, David. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, this will be a lot of fun. So let's just give a little bit of sort of history and background. So I'm curious, I want to get into what is a civil rights officer or director and some of that, but how did you even get into this whole field in the first place?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that when I think about my history, I feel like almost this field chose me. Okay. I think from the very beginning when, and I won't go through my whole history here, but, I was born and raised in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn. And I will say that this was during a time where the neighborhood was majority Italian American. We were the only Black family that lived in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn at that time. And I think to this day, I've never met another Black family that was from Bensonhurst at that time. And so early on, I had a lot of opportunity to think about the intersection of race and how we actually interact and the ways in which it works and doesn't work. And, what is it that is needed to have us create communities where folks see one another, where we could actually be in partnership. And so I started thinking about this very early on. When I ended up going into college, I thought I was going to be a constitutional and civil rights attorney, and found that there was a program in my school. I went to University of Rochester that was focused on creating teachers who could go out and teach about race, class, and gender in education. And so I ended up getting a master's program in education that was focused on that. And then I decided for myself, I loved the work that I was doing in education. I really could see myself being a teacher. But one of the things that I knew, even at that early age, was when you leave the educational setting and you go into the workforce, the first things people will tell you is, you know what, that's all theory, doesn't work out here. What you have to do here is be more pragmatic. And I was committed that it could. And so I wanted to be someone who could bridge theory with actual practical work application. So before I even knew there was a thing called diversity, as it was back then, I was committed that this is something I wanted to work on. And eventually, getting into the workforce, I found that there was a field called diversity. And instantly I knew that this was for me. And I've been working in this field ever since.
Oh, very cool. So when you were at New Jersey Transit, what is I've not heard the phrase before, Chief Civil Rights Officer. I've heard of Chief Diversity Officers, but not a Civil Rights Officer. So what is that? Define that for me.
Yeah, it's one. Absolutely. It's one of those things that a lot of folks don't think about. A lot of times we tend to think that there is a law, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
Civil Rights Act is created. There's now a
Mm-hmm.
law. This is taking care of everything. But that's unfortunately not the way that things work. It's a bit more complicated than that. So after there is a law, a federal law, there then is a bunch of guidance that comes out about how this law actually has to be applied, in this case, to federal agencies that fall underneath it, and then the state agencies who are funded out of those federal agencies. And so when it comes to how are the civil rights laws going to actually be applied in the day-to-day experience of people, you need folks inside of organizations who do that work.
Hmm.
And so it was my pleasure to be somebody who was working at that time in New Jersey Transit to actually help the organization understand how does it abide by the guidance that is intended to have that organization be in compliance with the law. And so civil rights is what we call that because that's the sort of governing laws that give the
Mm-hmm.
guidance. But it's really the administrative part of how we actually practically in the day to day see to it that the law is carried out. And that's what I did for about 15 years.
So give me an example of what would be a situation that might come to you where maybe the organization wasn't appropriately living to what the law required, and you needed to be involved to help them understand what had to be done. What would be a practical, typical example of what you would deal with?
Absolutely. So let's take something that I think a lot of folks may take for granted. So Title VI of the Civil Rights Act says you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, color, or national origin, right, when you're providing services. So what does that actually look like? Well, in transportation, in the field I was working at, one of the things that you look at is how are we providing service to people? Are we providing it in an equitable way? How would we know if we were doing that? And so if we're going to say, decide where buses are going to go, where trains are going to go, who's going to get what buses or trains, if we're going to make a major change to our service or reduce our service, how do we know that we do that in a way that's not going to be discriminatory? What are our assurances? Well, there's a body of knowledge and there's
Uh-huh.
ways to do that. And there's equity analyses and those things are done and they're completed by the organization. And then there's an office like mine that objectively looks to see that we applied it correctly. And if there are any adverse impacts, as we call them, or disproportionate burdens, that we engage the organization and what can we do to minimize or mitigate those impacts so that we're sure we're providing this service in a way that is fair and equitable. So that's a good example of like something that happens all the time that folks don't think about.
I wouldn't.
But if you're deciding services, that's one of those ways where, however unintentionally, there could be a discriminatory impact. We want to make sure that we don't do that.
I would never have thought of, okay, in transportation, where you choose to deliver service or where you make stops and things like that would never have occurred to me to even think about, might that disadvantage some portion of the population?
Yes.
Fascinating. So let's talk about this whole topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because clearly there's a lot of misunderstanding, and I myself will acknowledge I'm not sure that I have a full understanding. There's certainly a lot of misunderstanding about what is that? What does that really mean when people talk about DEI? And why? Well, first let's talk about what it means, and second, I want to go into, so why is it so misunderstood? And why is there such a backlash against this? So let's start with defining, what does that actually mean in the first place?
Oh, and I love this question. So diversity, equity, and inclusion is probably, I think, the most misunderstood thing in public discussion today. So breaking them all down, when we talk about diversity, what is that? Well, diversity, the way that I explain it when I talk to folks about it, is that it is really the fact that human variation exists.
Okay.
And it matters that it exists. And what do we mean by human variation? Well, there is the Lotan and Rossner wheel, which for a long time we used as the basis, the diversity wheel, to talk about this. And what it says is that we vary in any number of dimensions. At our core and personality, we're different. And we have a lot of science that backs up we have different personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Moving out from that, there's a lot of things about us intrinsically that are different. We have different races, different ethnicities. We're all different ages. We have different gender identities. We have different physical abilities. Moving out from that, we have different levels of income. We have different educational backgrounds. We have different regions of the country we come from. We know very much today, we have different political affiliations. When you get out into the organization, people work in different parts of the organization. They work out in the field or in the front lines, or some folks work in the office. All of that variation matters. It may not all be equally important. That's not the argument, but it certainly all matters. And it matters because people bring their perspectives and their experiences based on where they come from into work every day, into the communities that they're a part of. And so all of that human variation, we want to account for because especially for those of us that are intentional about building cultures, we want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to succeed and thrive, that they have access to the tools and resources and experiences that would allow them to do that. And if there is human variation in all these different ways, well, we know that folks aren't going to come in necessarily with the same level of being ready to engage in our cultures, being ready to thrive in the ways we want them to. And so we want to meet them where they are. And this is just talking about the people in our organizations. You can imagine this also applies to our customers, to community members, and on and on. So that's diversity, right? That human variation exists in all these dimensions. When we do engage with, okay, so now we have to address what is it that these different groups, these different individuals are going to need to have to succeed and thrive? What tools and resources, what experiences, what do we need to adjust about our systems to allow that to be so? We are now engaged in equity. How do we actually look to create equitable circumstances? We can't create equal circumstances because diversity exists. So we can't create everything the same for everyone, but we can say, how do we make sure everyone succeeds and thrives and has access to those opportunities? Well, if we're thinking about how do we do that, and how do we do that responsibly and really in a way that is respectful and insightful, we have to actually engage the people who are members of these particular different groups. And so we have to have conversations with them. We can't just sort of read a book. We can't just ask them as much as possible. We have to get them involved in the process. We actually have to share the ability to create the systems with them in ways that allow them to actually have a say. This is inclusion, how we get people involved in the process of creating equitable systems to address the diversity that we experience. And when you frame it that way, when you talk about how it's really inclusive of everyone and the fact that we vary, we want everyone to succeed and thrive, and we want to make sure that everyone has a say, it then becomes obvious that DEI is not about this or that group. It's about everyone. It's a frame in how we look at our cultures to make sure that everyone who comes into our organization, be they as an employee or as a customer, has the opportunity to succeed and thrive. And that's what we're after ultimately in DEI inside of the work context.
That's a really helpful explanation of all three of those. So let me ask you a question that might seem, what's the word I want to use? It might seem obvious or even, well, let me just ask it. Forget forget trying to frame it. So why is this important? And how does this contribute? And I ask this not as a question of doubt, but as a question of curiosity. Why is DEI and the way you've described it important to the success of a company? So I'm running a company, and what I really care about most, not that I don't care about my people, I do, but I care most about, I want us to perform at the highest level so that we can be successful in our marketplace in whatever our product or service is. Why does it matter to me? Why should it matter to me that I'm paying attention to making sure that everybody has an equal opportunity?
Absolutely.
Or an equitable opportunity?
So, yeah, let's take this. So again, from the employer perspective, because I like that framing for it. Keeps it very tight to what we're thinking about here. We're thinking about folks who create cultures for their organizations, right? Well, for one, I know that I want the top talent available to work in my company. And I know that the top talent doesn't just look one way. Talent varies. And so I want to make sure I'm positioning myself to get the top talent that is available. That's not only meaning I want to make sure that anyone of any race or anyone of any sexual orientation or gender identity can work in my organization if they have the talent I'm looking for. I want to make sure that if someone is a parent, they can work in my organization. If they have a disability that they are faced with, that they want to work in my organization and they know this is a place where they will be seen and thrive. I know I want to position my company as a place where folks who want to, if I'm publicly traded, contribute, that they want to devote money to it. I want to make sure that I'm looking responsible and being responsible as a corporate citizen. And so I want to position myself to say, hey, I care about communities. I want to make sure that I'm reflective of them. And so I want to appeal to the people who might invest in my company and my organization. If I'm reaching out to customers, I know that is not just one group of people who have dollars to spend. So I want to make sure I position my products and position my services in ways that will appeal to the broadest cross-section of people who I think may want to do business with me. And so I want to think about the various ways in which I do that. And not just at the front end, but when they're in the door, I want to make sure that everybody has the opportunity to succeed and thrive. If you are an employee, it's not just about attracting talent, it's about retaining it. It's about making sure that all talent has the opportunity to rise to the greatest level of their ability. And my opportunity to do that is when I create an environment where whoever comes in my door, I make sure I meet them and I have the opportunity to engage them in the different kinds of support that they're going to need and the different kinds of processes and systems that will help them succeed and thrive. If there's anything inside of my organization that will inhibit that or limit that, I want to make sure I get that out of the way so that the talent can rise. So this is not about, doing something for some specifically social reason. There's social good to be had here. Certainly, I believe in that and I'm supportive of it. So I'm not saying that doesn't matter. Right. But I'm saying that these are business reasons.
Yeah.
People do this because they
performing
recognize
at a higher level.
Absolutely. We want to make the best organization that we can. And to do that, we want to appeal to the broadest cross-section of people available who have the talent and certainly the financial resources that we want to tap into to have our organization succeed.
Makes sense. So given the way you've described that, and I'm sure, again, it's often misunderstood, so I appreciate the clarity you're bringing to this for me and our audience. So why is there this backlash? I'm sure it's rooted in misunderstanding of it, but everything you described, it would be hard for me to imagine a normal human being saying, I don't think that's a good idea. All of that you've described makes all the sense in the world, would help our companies to be better companies. Why would there be a backlash? Why are people, why is DEI on the out these days?
Yes, this is always a big question, right?
Yeah.
And so, I've thought about this long and hard, as you can imagine, and really examined a lot of what was said. And really it boils down to that the backlash against DEI is about misidentification of what DEI is. And generally that misidentification comes in two forms. And the first form is DEI for some folks is boiled down to efforts to improve the conditions for some specific subset of people. And so maybe in popular discussion, that is just for minorities or just for members of the LGBTQIA community. And it's just about advancing their condition. And so folks who aren't necessarily part of those communities or supportive of efforts to support those communities for whatever their reasons think that if that's what DEI is, I'm not supportive of it. I don't think that that's something that, organizations should do, let alone, governments and that kind of thing. So that's the first form of misidentification. The second form I actually think is much more common, which is that people see some specific application of DEI, and then they think that's all DEI is. A particular example of this that comes up a lot is when it comes to recruitment. So an organization says that, we're not really representative of the communities that we serve. We want to be more reflective. And when it comes to our talent pool, we want to increase our talent pool. And our talent pool, when we look at our data, only looks one way. We want to make efforts to actually diversify our talent. And so we're going to specifically target and look for communities of color. We're going to look for resources and recruitment resources in places where this talent lies, where we might not be accessing it using our traditional recruitment methods. And people may object to that. They may say, well, you shouldn't consider race. It should be anyone that comes in the door, or you should just look at the general recruitment resources. You shouldn't do anything additional or extra to try to target a particular group of people to bring them into the organization. And then they think that's all DEI is. It's fascinating to me when folks talk about DEI from the recruitment perspective, as if that's all DEI is. And yet it's for the entire life cycle of the employee experience, let alone any part of the employee experience. And I think this is actually much more common. If you look, I think, at the two main issues that people will talk about, well, here's why DEI is bad. They will usually either talk about recruitment, and they'll make some sort of assertion that, this is somehow limiting talent, or, some sort of discriminatory effect is happening here because they're looking at and recruiting and looking to expand their recruiting into specific venues. Or they'll talk about, usually if it is, folks of trans identity, a trans experience, they'll say this is about, who gets access to what bathrooms, or who gets to be a part of what sports team. And they'll limit DEI to just those conversations. Now, there are real sound arguments for why people would do those things. But, the fact is, if people disagree, that's not all that DEI is. There's still much more out there. So even if there's some aspect, some application of DEI that somebody is not in agreement with, they get to not to be in agreement with that. But
it doesn't throw out the
whole
entire
of DEI, yes,
right,
actually is beneficial to you, however you are. I'll make this one point, which I think makes it a very salient argument. A lot of times, especially when it comes to issues of people of trans experience, actually, moving through life and looking to be in spaces where their identity can be honored, many of the objections will be religious objection. And there'll be people who'll say that I, as a person of faith, object to this. And they'll put their reasons forward. And they'll say that as a person of faith, I should not have to do something that I think is wrong or participate in something that I don't believe in. When they are making that argument, they're making a DEI argument. They're saying, as a person of faith, which falls under DEI, there's a certain way I want my voice to be heard. There's a certain experience I want to have. We can engage in those conversations, but understand that the premise you are making that argument on relies on you being a member of a community that's not everyone, with a voice that you want to make sure is heard. And if you believe in that, then you want DEI.
That's a really fascinating point of view and perspective, or way of framing that. So let me restate how I'm understanding that, and you tell me if I've got this right. So what you're really saying is, when I have a point of view that says anything that I'm against this or I'm for that, I'm actually advocating for DEI, because to a great extent, I am representing that I have a particular point of view. I come from a certain, whether it's faith background or other background, but I come from a certain perspective, and I want to make sure that my perspective is included in the conversation. And DEI is really about the inclusiveness of the diversity that we all bring. And so while I say I'm against DEI, I'm actually advocating for DEI at the same time when I do that.
Absolutely. And I would put in there and sharpen just anytime it's connected to identity.
Got it.
Right? So if we say we have to take care of our veterans, that's a DEI argument. We have to take care of our farmers. That is a DEI argument. We're saying these people in this condition who have this experience, we need to pay attention to them, and we need to support them so that they can succeed and thrive.
So let me ask you this, Leo. So how do we, again, I love the fact that you are very practical in how do we apply these things in real settings, not just theory. So how do we balance recognizing that people come from different perspectives, and we want to be able to give them equitable, not equal, but equitable access to the ability to thrive, and yet sometimes that could be very costly. So let me give you a simple example. Think about the whole Americans with Disabilities Act. We want to give people who have certain disabilities the ability to, get into a building, to have access to facilities, et cetera. And yet sometimes that's a very, very small minority of people and an extraordinary amount of money being spent for a very small number of people. How do we reconcile doing what seems to be a fair and appropriate thing to do, and yet we're in a world of limited resources? And does it make sense to spend extraordinary resources for a small number of people? How do we reconcile that thought?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting challenge, right? Because we're always looking at the dollars and cents and does this make dollars and cents to do a certain thing? I think that for one, a couple of ways to look at this.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times when we are engaging and I think the ADA is a very interesting one in my civil rights work, right? Because there were laws that said you had to do this. There would constantly be debates about why do we need to invest in and spend this money? And one of the things that I think is a really interesting way to think about this is, the concept of universal design, which is that if you make a space accessible for the broadest cross-section of people, it's actually good for everyone. We tend to think about if you're going to make this space accessible for people who use wheelchairs, but that's going to cost a lot of money. You have to build all of this extra infrastructure.
Mm-hmm.
What we tend not to think about is how easy that makes people who use strollers to move their kids around, for people who have a condition that affects their ability to ambulate and to move, right? And so a ramp may be easier for them to use than navigating stairs. Stairs can be very hard on the body. And so when we think about places and we think first, who's going to use these spaces? Who's going to actually use them? And we design that forward, we're going to do a better job of making sure that we create something that everybody can use and get the full benefit of, which has its own, of course, long-term financial benefit for access. But I think that, the other thing is that there's very practical approaches to all of this. So even within the ADA, there's, when that law was created and, then amended, there was already a built environment that existed. And there wasn't, this, you have to go in and take a magic wand and then spend the billions and billions and billions of dollars it will take to do everything. What it said was, when you are going to make a substantial change to something, if you're going to say these stairs are rotted out, we're going to tear down these stairs. Well, now you have an opportunity to think about an elevator because you're going to tear down the stairs. So before, nobody was saying, you had to tear down the stairs that were in good condition and build an elevator. But now you're going to substantially change the way that people access whatever that was. So now you have the opportunity to think about how you can make this more accessible. And so the intention is things become accessible over time. We make reasonable steps forward. And for so much of DEI, it is like that, right? And I want to be clear that, there's a distinction between what the law requires and what DEI says, which is often above and beyond what the law requires. But, every organization gets to look at what can we do above and beyond what is required by law to move us forward in accommodating the people who we want to have be in our organizations and use our services. And there's no one saying that you have to do everything. You certainly don't have to do everything all at once. But what can you do to move this forward? And so, built into the law and built into the philosophy is the idea that, of course, if it's going to bankrupt the organization to do it, it's not a smart thing to do and you can't do it.
Sure.
But, you also, on the other hand, can't say, well, that's going to be more expensive than I'd like, so I'm not going to do it, right? There does have to be some reasonable consideration of, well, this is going to cost a bit more money, but this is going to move us forward from the perspective of the law toward creating the society that we want, and from the perspective of those of us that create cultures, creating the cultures and the organizations that we want.
And that's where we'll pause part one of my conversation with Leo Sanders, Senior Director of Human Resources, Inclusion, and Belonging at the League of Women Voters. I love how Leo helped us to redefine DEI in plain, simple language, showing how it connects to performance and ultimately fairness. When we come back, he'll take us deeper into representation, language, and the everyday actions that create belonging.
This has been Culture Architects with David J. Friedman. Join us next time for more insights and wisdom from great leaders in all walks of life. To book David for your next event or to learn more about his writing, speaking, or consulting, go to davidjfriedman.com. Culture Architects with David J. Friedman is a production of CultureWise.